how God will accomplish his purpose during the 70th week. And the primary thing I mentioned or that we saw is that God will use the antichrist as a rod of anger to chastise Israel. And then we concluded talking a bit about how God uses even evil men, such as the Antichrist, to accomplish his will. And I gave a prime example of Judas Iscariot, that God, Judas had no good intentions, but God used him to lead to Christ being crucified for our sins. And I want to just talk a little bit more about that general topic. So turn to Luke chapter 17. And this is, I think, an interesting verse on this general topic of God using the wicked to accomplish his purposes. So Luke chapter 17 and verse 1 says, "Then said he unto the disciples, it is impossible that offenses will come. Sorry, it is impossible but that offenses will come. But woe unto him through whom they come." So Christians often are led to believe that they have to choose between Calvinism and Arminianism. And many Christians don't even know what those words mean, but that's the basic choice that they're given, even if those words aren't used, is they have to choose between one of those two systems. But this verse, Luke 17:1, is an example of why both of those are wrong. And I noticed many years ago when I was studying this issue of Calvinism and Arminianism, and I was told that I have to decide which one I believe is true. And as I was reading and studying the scriptures, I thought neither one of them are true. And I found many times in life, we are given a choice between two things, as though we have to choose this one or the second one. But oftentimes, neither one of them are true. There's a third option, or maybe even more, that is more true than the two options that were offered. And so I believe that's the case here. So if you look at Luke chapter 17 and verse 1, the Calvinists emphasize in that verse him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. And so they say that God predetermined everything that happened before the creation of the world, and now he's sovereignly making sure that everything happens as he predetermined. So again, they emphasize that part of verse 1, but they ignore the part of verse 1 where it says, "Ye have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain," where it puts the decision making and responsibility for the decisions on man. Arminianism, on the other hand, in verse 1, they ignore him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, and they instead emphasize, "Ye have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain." So, but both things in verse 1 are true. All of verse 1 is true, and we ought to believe both. We don't have to choose to believe Calvinism or choose to believe Arminianism. We instead can choose to believe the Word of God. Look in Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4, and Jean Gross, would you read verses 26 to 28?
Acts 4, 26 to 28. "The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together, for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done."
Okay, so here we have, in this passage, we have wicked kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ, but they unknowingly did, as it says, whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. So here's another passage where God determined something would be done, but it was done by wicked people with a free will to make their wicked decisions. And just one more verse on this, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Look at Psalm 76. And this is a very, very good verse on this topic. Psalm 76. And Dick, would you read verse 10?
Okay. Psalm 76, verse 10. Okay. Surely the, excuse me, surely the wrath of man shall praise thee. The remainder of wrath shall thou restrain.
So, of course, the wrath of man hates God and wants to oppose God and defeat God. And yet this verse says, surely the wrath of man shall praise thee. So God will carry out his purposes, whatever man decides, including whatever wicked men decide. And so on the topic that we were talking about last week, God will primarily carry out his purposes for the 70th week by using the Antichrist to punish Israel. All right, then let's move on to the next topic or the next issue. And the next thing I want to consider the extent of the rule of the Antichrist, and also along with that, along with that, who will be required to take the mark of the beast. So remember again that we've seen that God has a purpose to use the Antichrist to chastise Israel. So God has no purpose in the 70th week to use the Antichrist to chastise the whole world or to rule over the whole world. If you remember, we went through, you can turn back to the book of Daniel, turn to Daniel chapter 2. We looked extensively at the end of Daniel chapter 9, and we saw in verse 24, it says that the 70 weeks concern thy people, and that, of course, would be Israel, and thy holy city, which, of course, would be Jerusalem. So that's what God's purpose concerns. So the book of Daniel, again, will be very helpful and very important as we consider this topic. So in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And in this chapter, Daniel gives the interpretation of the dream. And he says that the interpretation involves a prophecy of 4 kingdoms. And we've looked at this some in the past, so I won't spend a great deal of time on this, but we'll just quickly identify these 4 kingdoms. So in Daniel chapter 2, Meg, would you read verses 37 and 38?
Thou, O King, art a King of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them. Thou art this head of gold.
All right, so when he says thou, O king, in beginning of verse 37, he of course is speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So at the end of verse 38, when he says thou art this head of gold, that tells us that the first kingdom prophesied here is the kingdom of Babylon. Then turn over to chapter 5 in Daniel. And while you're turning to chapter 5, Jean gave me a note that twice I've referred to what I said last week, but of course we weren't here last week. So, so she wanted to make sure nobody thought that they missed out last week. So last time is what I should have said. All right, Daniel chapter 5. And Sharon, would you read verse 28?
Uh, 528. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
All right, so this,
Heirs.
no, wait. Okay, getting an echo when Sharon's unmuted tonight for some reason. All right, so the second kingdom is identified here in chapter 5 and verse 28, and that's the kingdom of Media Persia. Then turn to chapter 8 in Daniel. Chapter 8, and would Dan or Laura read verses 20 and 21?
Chapter 8, verse 20 and 21. The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn is between his eyes, is the first king.
All right, so you see in verse 20, he refers to Media and Persia, so that's the second kingdom. And then in the next verse, in verse 21, he refers to the king of Grecia. So the third kingdom is the kingdom of Greece. And then the fourth kingdom, we'll look at more later, and we have looked at it in the past, but the fourth kingdom is the kingdom of the Antichrist. So it's not real clear, in fact, it's not clear in chapter 2 where the kingdom of the Antichrist is located or where the Antichrist will come from. Then look in chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, George, would you read verse 3?
And 4 great beasts, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another.
All right, so here we learn that it says it prophesies about 4 great beasts, and it says that they came up from the sea, and that would be the Mediterranean Sea. So that gives us some idea here also of the geography involved with this. So in this vision in Daniel chapter 7, again, it speaks of 4 beasts. The fourth beast here is again prophetic of the Antichrist and his kingdom. So again in Daniel chapter 7, Erin, would you read verse 7?
I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns.
Okay, so just as in Daniel chapter 2, where the 4 kingdoms are prophesied, the first 3 are only briefly mentioned. And then there's much more detail on the 4th kingdom, which again is a kingdom of the Antichrist. So also here in chapter 7, the first 3 beasts are briefly mentioned. But again, the 4th beast, there's much more detail given about it. So here in chapter 7 and verse 7, it says the 4th beast is dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. But again, here in chapter 7, we're not given the precise location of the kingdom of the Antichrist. We do know that it will arise in the area of the Mediterranean Sea, but that's all we learn here. Okay, then in Daniel chapter 8, and earlier we read verses 20, and which is the second kingdom, and then verse 21, the third kingdom. So now in Daniel chapter 8, would Seng Joyce read verse 22?
That being broken, whereas those stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power.
Okay, so in verse 22 here, we learn that the kingdom of Greece, which was mentioned in verse 21, will be divided into 4 kingdoms. Okay, now I believe that secular, if you read commentaries and Christian books and so forth, they will go into a lot of detail about secular history, sometimes incorrectly, as we've talked about, but sometimes I believe correctly. But I don't believe that secular history is necessary to correctly understand these prophecies in the book of Daniel. In other words, I believe if you don't have access to secular history, I believe you can still understand these prophecies just with the word of God. However, and we've seen some of that already, and I'll show more as we go along. But as we go through history, we can see that some of these prophecies have been fulfilled. So we now look back in history at the first kingdom, the Babylonian Empire, and we look back at the second kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire, and we look back at the third kingdom, the Greek Empire. Look back in again for a moment in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, and would Tim or Jean read verse 21?
Okay, Daniel 7, verse 21. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them.
Let's see. You read the verse I told you to, but let's see. I wrote down a wrong reference. Okay, actually, chapter 8. That was the problem. Chapter 8. And chapter 8, and would you read verse 21? So again, that was my mistake.
Okay, chapter 8, verse 21. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king.
Okay, so again, I believe this first king mentioned in this verse is Alexander the Great. And so again, we can look back in history now and see that the first king of the Greek Empire was Alexander the Great. And also we can look back in history now and we can see that the Greek kingdom or the Greek Empire was divided into 4 kingdoms, as is prophesied in chapter 8 and verse 22. Okay, then Daniel chapter 8, and Sally, would you read verse 9?
And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land.
Okay, so this little horn here is the Antichrist, and it says that he waxes great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And we'll talk more about that later. But then also in Daniel chapter 8, Pakinatan, would you read verse 23? So Daniel chapter 8, verse 23.
later time of the kingdom, and when the transgressions are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentence shall stand up.
All right, so notice here in verse 23, the Antichrist is referred to as the king of fierce countenance. So in chapter 8, we learn that the Antichrist will come from one of these four kingdoms. So again, the Greek kingdom or Greek empire was divided into four, and now we see the Antichrist will come from one of those four. So Daniel chapter 8 does not specifically identify where these four kingdoms are located. But again, I don't believe that secular history is necessary to understand these things. But secular history tells us that the Greek Empire was divided into four kingdoms. And sometimes if you look at different sources, they might be worded slightly differently as far as the names they give to these. But I'll just give you an example that's common. So it was again divided into four kingdoms. So the first kingdom would include Macedonia and Greece. The second kingdom would include Bithynia, Thrace, and Mysia, basically modern day Turkey. The third kingdom would be Egypt, and the fourth would be Syria. So again, those are the four kingdoms that the Greek Empire was divided into. All right, then let's go to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, and Akun, would you read the first two verses in Daniel 11?
In the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I shew thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia.
Okay, so notice Daniel chapter 11 begins by referring to the second kingdom, the Media-Persian kingdom. And then at the end of verse 2, we find the third kingdom, Greece. So that orients us as to where we're at here now in chapter 11. And then again in Daniel chapter 11, would Dan or Lisa read verse 3? Daniel chapter 11, verse 3.
And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with a great dominion, and do according to his will.
Okay, and so the mighty king here again is, I believe, Alexander the Great. And then Dominic, would you read Daniel chapter 11 and verse 4?
And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those.
Okay, so notice in verse 4, again, we see that this Greek empire is divided into four kingdoms. So again, all of this we can now look back in history and see that these things have been fulfilled. Now notice in the King James that there's a paragraph mark before verse 5. So they're saying that a new paragraph begins with verse 5. And I believe that's the dividing point in this chapter, where the first 4 verses are, from our perspective, are now in the past. But verse 5, beginning in verse 5, it now takes us into the future, begins to prophesy about things that are not yet fulfilled. Okay, then Daniel chapter 11 and verse 5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So notice in verse 5, it speaks of the king of the south. Now, Bible prophecy always centers on Israel. So when you read king of the south, what is south of Israel? And that would be Egypt. And as we just talked about, Egypt, in fact, was one of the four kingdoms that the Greek Empire was divided into. In fact, it was the southernmost kingdom of the four. Okay, then in verse 5, Dick, would you read Daniel chapter 11 and verse 6, sorry.
Okay, 11 verse 6. Let's see, I went past it here. Just a moment, let me get back up here. Okay, having a little trouble. Verse 6. Oh, come on, man. Okay, and in the end of years they shall join themselves together. For the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, not his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times.
Okay, so notice in verse 6 the mention of the king of the north. And again, considering that prophecy centers on Israel, what is north of Israel? And that would be Syria. So, and again, Syria was one of the four kingdoms that the Greek Empire was divided into. So it's, I believe, now clear as we begin chapter 11 that the Antichrist will come from either Egypt or Syria. As we go through the book of Daniel, it narrows it down more and more. And now it's narrowed down to either Egypt or Syria. Okay, then as we continue to read through Daniel chapter 11, and we won't, it's a fairly lengthy chapter and a tremendous amount of detail given. But there's a series of conflicts between the king of the south and the king of the north. And during this time, as we read through Daniel 11, there are several kings of the north. So let's jump forward to Daniel chapter 11. And Meg, would you read verse 19?
Verse 19. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found.
Okay, so in verse 19, the king of the north, it says, shall stumble and fall and not be found. So now there's going to be a new king of the north. And Jean Gross, would you read chapter 11 and verse 20?
Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle.
So in verse 20, we have a new king of the north, and we're told that he's a raiser of taxes, which is seldom popular. And so we're told in verse 20, but within few days he shall be destroyed. So now there's going to be another new king of the north. So again in Daniel chapter 11, and Sharon, would you read verse 21?
And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries.
All right, so now in verse 21, again, we have a new king of the north, and it says, in his estate shall stand up a vile person. This vile person in verse 21 is the Antichrist. So we now know that the Antichrist will be the king of the north. He will come from Syria. So he doesn't come from Rome or Russia or whatever else people might, or the United States or whatever people might imagine, but he clearly comes from the north, from Syria. And this is confirmed in several other passages. So keep Daniel open, but turn to the book of Isaiah, chapter 10. And we actually looked at this verse last time, but Isaiah chapter 10, and would Dan or Laura read verse 5?
10:5,
Yes.
10:4. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation.
All right. So again, we talked about this verse last time, how the Antichrist will be the rod of mine anger. And so notice in verse 5 that he's referred to as the Assyrian. And later we'll look at other passages, but he's clearly identified here as the Assyrian, not the American, Roman, Russian, whatever, but the Assyrian. Now, so what is the difference between Syria and Assyria? And the difference is that the Assyrian Empire in secular history is a larger empire or kingdom than only Syria. So Assyria would include modern day Syria, but it would also include modern day Lebanon, part of Turkey, Iraq, and part of Iran. So again, it's a larger kingdom than just the nation of Syria. Look in Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8, and we read this verse earlier, but George, would you read verse 9? Daniel chapter 8, verse 9.
And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land.
So again, the little horn in this verse is the Antichrist, and it says that he will come against the south, so that would be Egypt, and that he will come against the east, and that's likely Persia or modern day Iran. And then it says he will come against the pleasant land, which would be Israel. And so it should be kept in mind, though, that the borders of the Assyrian Empire vary as you go through history. So if you look up a map of the Assyrian Empire, and it will vary somewhat depending on what year the map is reflecting. So keep that in mind. And also the Assyrian kingdom or empire that we might look at in past secular history does not necessarily exactly match the borders of this prophesied Assyrian kingdom. So it certainly gives us a rough idea of where it is. But again, it's not necessarily going to be an exact match if you look at a map from whatever year in the past of the Assyrian Empire. All right, turn to Isaiah chapter 52. So Egypt, the king of the south, and Assyria, the kingdom north of Israel, appear again and again and again in prophetic passages. So we won't spend a great deal of time talking about these verses, but just let me show you this, how you see these two kingdoms again and again when you read Old Testament prophecy. So Isaiah chapter 52, and Erin, would you read verse 4?
Thus saith the Lord God, my people went down aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause.
Okay, so the only thing I want to note from this verse at this point is that it mentions Egypt and it mentions the Assyrian. Then Hosea chapter 11. Hosea chapter 11, and would Seng or Joyce read verse 5?
Shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refuse to return.
All right, so again, note in verse 5, it speaks of the land of Egypt, and it refers to the Assyrian. And then again in the book of Hosea, would Tim or Jean read verse 1? Hosea chapter 12, verse 1.
12:1. Ephraim feedeth on wind, and followeth after the east wind. He daily increaseth lies and desolation, and they do make a covenant with the Assyrians, and oil is carried into Egypt.
All right, so again, notice it mentions the Assyrians and it mentions Egypt. Okay, then the book of Zechariah, chapter 10, and we're by no means going to look at all of the references that we could, but I want to look at a few of them so you can see that over and over you find the mention of these two places, Egypt and Assyria. All right, so Zechariah chapter 10, and Sally, would you read verses 10 and 11?
I will bring them again also out of the land of Egypt, and gather them out of Assyria, and I will bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon, and place shall not be found for them. And he shall pass through the sea with affliction, and shall smite the waves of the sea in the sea, and all the deeps of the river shall dry up, and the pride of Assyria shall be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart away.
All right, so again in verse 10, it mentions the land of Egypt and it mentions Assyria. And then again in verse 11, it speaks of the pride of Assyria and the scepter of Egypt. So again, we could look at a number of other passages, but when we read Old Testament prophecy, we see over and over the mention of these two places. So that fits very well with what we've seen in Daniel chapter 11. And also when we read about the history of Israel as given in the Old Testament, we find that Israel had a history or had a pattern of looking to Egypt or to Assyria for help, rather than looking for God to protect and provide for them. So they get into trouble in Old Testament history. Instead of trusting God, they again would look to either Egypt or to Assyria for help. And so we also see these two nations prominent in that sense. Then look in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 23. Ezekiel chapter 23, and Pakinatan, would you read verse 3?
Committed whoredoms in Egypt. They committed whoredoms in their youth. They were their breasts pressed, and there they bruised the teats of their virginity.
Okay, so just take note of it talks about them committing whoredom here. And then again and notice, sorry, it mentions they committed whoredoms in Egypt. Okay, then again in Ezekiel chapter 23, Akun, would you read verse 5?
Oholah played the harlot when she was mine, and she doted on her lovers, on the Assyrians, her neighbors.
So in verse 3, we saw that they're committing whoredoms in Egypt. And then verse 5, they're playing the harlot with the Assyrians. Okay, then again in Ezekiel 23, and let's go down to verse 7. Thus she committed her whoredoms with them, with all of them that were the chosen men of Assyria, and with all on whom she doted. With all their idols she defiled herself. Neither left she her whoredoms, neither left she her whoredoms brought from Egypt, for in her youth they lay with her, and they bruised the breasts of her virginity, and poured their whoredom upon her. Wherefore I have delivered her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, upon whom she doted. So we see here in Ezekiel 23 that, as I mentioned, Israel would, instead of looking to God, they would look to Egypt or Assyria for help. And we learn here in Ezekiel 23 that they also then partook of the idolatry of the Egyptians and the idolatry of the Assyrians. Okay, then turn to Zephaniah chapter 2. So Zephaniah chapter 2. And Dominic, would you read verse 13? Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 13.
And against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness.
Okay, so notice he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. So Assyria is the north here, as is the case in Daniel chapter 11. So as I mentioned, I don't believe that secular history is necessary to understand these prophecies in Daniel 11. As we look at other Old Testament passages, we again and again and again see that Egypt is south, Assyria is the north. And then, and so as often is said and correctly, scripture interprets itself. And so I certainly believe that's the case here. Okay, then let's turn to the book of Nahum. So if you're in Zephaniah, just turn back a little bit and you'll find Nahum. And Nahum chapter 3 and verse 18. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. So the Antichrist is frequently identified, as again here in verse 18, as the Assyrian or the king of Assyria. Right? Then let's go back to Daniel chapter 11. And so we left off in Daniel chapter 11 with verse 21, where we find the vile person, who again is the Antichrist. So now Daniel chapter 11, and would Dan or Lisa read verse 22?
Hold on, Dan.
Okay.
11:22.
Yes.
And with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown for him, and he shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant.
So notice in verse 22, the Antichrist is the prince of the covenant. And that's because, as we have talked about, Israel will sign a covenant with the Antichrist. And so that is, as we've seen, that is the official beginning of the 70th week, when Israel signs this covenant with the Antichrist. If you just look back for a moment in chapter 9, and we talked in detail about these last verses in Daniel chapter 9, but in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, it says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." And so that again is the official beginning of the 70th week. Now, it's often taught that by prophecy preachers and prophecy books, that the first 3.5 years of the 70th week is a time of peace. I can't tell you how many books and articles and sermons and so forth I was exposed to years ago, where it would say the first 3.5 years is a time of peace, and they would imply world peace. And then the last 3.5 years, they say that war breaks out. But that's not true. So in Daniel chapter 11, and notice verse 25. And so again, we kind of know the context here. Verse 21, the vile person is the Antichrist. Verse 22, he's the prince of the covenant, and so forth. Now notice Daniel chapter 11, verse 25. "And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him." So in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 25, again, it says, "He," referring to the Antichrist, the king of the north, "shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army." So that's not peace. So that teaching that the first 3.5 years is a time of peace worldwide or even in the Middle East, that's not true. And not only is the Antichrist not ruling the entire world at this time, but verse 25 says, "But the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army." So Egypt is strongly opposing the Antichrist here in the first 3.5 years with a great and mighty army. And then Daniel chapter 11, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 27?
Daniel 11:27, right? "And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed."
Okay, so in verse 27, we see that the king of Egypt and the king of Assyria, the Antichrist, are going to have peace talks. But in verse 27, it says, "Both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table." So they lie to one another as they're having these peace talks, sitting at the same table. And then Daniel chapter 11, and Dick, would you read verse 28? Daniel 11:28.
Okay. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land.
All right, so again in verse 27, there are failed peace talks because they lie to one another. And now in verse 28, the Antichrist returns into his land with great riches. And basically what's going on there is that they both lied to one another, but the the king of the north, the Antichrist, outsmarted Egypt. And so he, again, in verse 28, he returns into his land with great riches. And it's very significant to note in verse 28 that it says that at that time, his heart shall be against the holy covenant. Now, that's not the covenant that he signed with Israel. Look back in Isaiah chapter 28. Isaiah chapter 28 and verse 15. Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. So verse 15 here, this is referring to the covenant that Israel signs with the Antichrist. And so here it's a covenant with death and with hell, and it refers to the lies and the falsehood involved with that covenant. But if you go back to Daniel chapter 11, and note in verse 28 that this refers to the holy covenant. So this is not talking about a covenant with death and with hell, or a covenant based on lies and falsehood, but this is the holy covenant. So what is the holy covenant? Turn to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1 and verse 72. To perform the mercy promised to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath which he sware to our father Abraham. So the holy covenant in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 28 is the covenant that God made with Abraham. And so we learn in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 28 that at this point, the Antichrist, it says that his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And so in effect, that means that at this point, the heart of the Antichrist turns against the saints in Israel, the saints who have been justified by faith and who are trusting in the covenant that God made with Abraham. Okay, then back to Daniel chapter 11, and just a couple things quickly before we conclude for today. So Daniel chapter 11 and then verse 29. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. So in verse 29, the Antichrist again goes to battle. He comes toward the south. So he again attacks Egypt. And we're told in verse 29 that this attack on Egypt shall not be as the former. That's referring back to verse 25. So verse 25 says, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. So the battle in verse 29 will not be as the former, the battle in verse 25, and it says it will not be as the latter. And the latter is referring to verse 42, and we'll save that and talk about that later when we get there. But that's the reference to the former and the latter in verse 29. And so the point is, in verse 25 and in verse 42, the Antichrist defeats Egypt in battle. But in verse 29, it says that this battle is not like those two. So this battle in verse 29, the Antichrist is unsuccessful in this attack that he launches. All right, so we'll stop there for now and pick it up next week. But Just a couple things I want to again note is that it's not true that the first 3.5 years are a time of peace. There's these constant battles, as we've seen, between Egypt and Syria. And also the Antichrist is not some powerful figure ruling over the whole world. In fact, he is defeated here in verse 29. In the first 3.5 years, he is defeated by Egypt. And so next time we'll carry on it, and we'll see how he is defeated, what happens here, and then carry on and learn more about the 70th week and the Antichrist. All right, thank you all very much, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you, Dan. Good night, Jean.
Good night,
everyone.
Meg.
Good night.
Thanks, Roses.
Good night.